And this is Weaponized.
We investigated a lot of these cases, and we found, because of these medical associations, we postulated that some kind of sampling exercise might be going on at the same time as the quote-unquote genuine mutilation. So that sort of brings this whole bidirectional mimicry hypothesis
What does
out.
that mean? I don't know what the word means.
So mimicry, here we have a phenomenon that began, we think, in the 1950s. It probably began earlier. But, you know, a lot of the cases started emerging in the late 1950s and 1960s of cattle mutilations all the way through the western part of the United States and also up in Canada, and actually in other countries too. So here we have a phenomenon that's quote-unquote genuine. But at the same time, we're finding these occasional cases where it's pretty obvious that somebody is using sedatives, is using hypodermic needles, and is using medical equipment to exsanguinate animals. So we postulated that there were two things going on simultaneously that were causing a lot of confusion. You've got, number one, a quote-unquote genuine phenomenon, and number two, you've got this medical surveillance project that is being carried out knowing that, you know, most veterinarians will not touch a mutilated animal because the quote-unquote aliens are associated with mutilated animals. So these small covert surveillance programs that are being carried out are being carried out knowing that the overall umbrella of cattle mutilations is protecting the perpetrators from being caught. So, I mean, that's the bidirectional mimicry. You've got the quote-unquote real phenomenon. You've got a small program that's hiding underneath the phenomenon, and then you've got the phenomenon that's actually mimicking, you know, the government surveillance program. So you've got this. You can create these Z plots, but the problem is that you're looking at cattle mutilations through the lens of two layers of deception. You know, so you've got the layer of deception from the phenomenon, and you've also got the layer of deception from the government program that is using cattle mutilations as a cover for a surveillance effort. So you've got two layers of deception. It's very, very difficult for an outsider coming into this to penetrate those two layers of deception. You can draw exactly the same plot for the UFO phenomenon. You know, the UFO phenomenon starts off as being genuine. Then we interviewed Colonel Barry Hennessy, who was the head of the infamous AFOSI PJ. We interviewed him as part of the OSOP program. He blatantly told us, he didn't tell us on camera, but he told us that they had used the UFO phenomenon as a cover for their advanced projects. And this guy was part of the Air Force, the AFOSI. So we have the same thing. We've got a quote-unquote genuine phenomenon. We've got a series of advanced technology projects, special access program going on using the UFO as a cover. And then you've got this sort of reverse engineering setup that's going on that are creating these, special access programs that are happening. And then you've got the phenomenon that is mimicking these special access programs. You know, you've got helicopters with impossible levels of acceleration. You've got, you know, craft flying around the place that look like triangular craft that should be part of the Air Force arsenal, but they're probably the phenomenon. So you've got this two layers of deception with the UFO phenomenon. So the question is, which we've been asking for decades, are they ours or theirs?
You eventually wrote a book about your ideas, Brain Trust it was called, where you're looking at the two levels. So there is a legitimate mystery, something carving up cattle, horses, sheep, dogs, cats, deer, other wild animals.
Elk,
it's not just cows.
Right.
That something has been doing this, taking particular parts. I'd be interested in why those parts, what they, whoever they are, could learn from it, and then the secondary monitoring, either government or industry, that is tracking something through the food chain. What were they looking for? What could be learned based on the parts that are being taken from these various animals?
Well, we put out the hypothesis at NIDS back in 2003. We were looking for what could possibly be of such interest that, I mean, normally if you want to track something, you go to slaughterhouses and you gather samples. I mean, there's nothing mysterious about that. But if you want to track spread of something through herds in the wild, the way you do it is illegal. I mean, you basically start sampling animals. If it's wildlife, it's not illegal. But if these are cattle that are owned by ranchers, it is illegal. So you do it under covert
like why wouldn't the
operations.
government just have their own staple of cows that they would
Yeah,
then
why would you go
sample?
steal somebody's cow and stand cover it
Because
up?
you're
Yeah.
tracking something that's moving through the food chain in the West of the United
to
States.
us, to our
Yeah.
food chain. Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
yeah. I mean, we're eating cows.
Right, but we're not eating the government's cows. So it's
No,
like
no.
that's why they're doing.
Well. I mean, the real kicker here is that there's a long history of. I mean, NIDS came up with the hypothesis that one of the possible infectious organisms that could be traveling surreptitiously through the herds was what is called a prion, which is an infectious protein.
Indestructible.
Indestructible, and it actually has destroyed a lot of the elk population, a lot of the deer population in the western part of the United States and Canada. But you know, it also infects cows, it infects deers and elk. So we looked at the hypothesis that the infectious organism, which is a very devastating disease, a brain disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, where a human's brain turns to Swiss cheese. In cows, it's called mad cow disease, and it erupted in the United Kingdom in the 1990s. And you know, people who were eating infected meat came down. Young people came down with these devastating brain diseases, where the brains became Swiss cheese, and they, you know, incurable, obviously. So the hypothesis that we were looking at is that this is so sort of toxic and very, very, I guess, inflammatory, is that a covert program was launched in the 60s and 70s to see how far these prions might have got from wildlife into the food chain.
When you say covert, you mean a government decided?
Yeah, well, probably a contractor.
A contractor on behest of a government?
Yes.
Did a covert program to track prions through the food chain.
That was the hypothesis that we were looking at, because
Got it.
there is you know, it was a very bizarre series of cause and effects that led to that hypothesis. But to cut a long story short, an NIH scientist out in Papua New Guinea was investigating this bizarre brain disease that people in Papua New Guinea were coming down with.
Cannibals.
Yeah, they were cannibals. They were eating their dead as a sign of respect. But the problem with eating their dead was they were eating these people's brains, and they would come down with this uncontrollable shaking, and they would die soon, you know, within a year or two of symptoms starting. So this guy, his name was Carlton Gajushek, he got the bright idea of, you know, he was kind of like a James Bond type. He would be out in the wilds, and these people would be dying all over the place of this uncontrollable disease. So he would open their skulls, take their brains out, which were infected with this thing, and he would ship them back to the National Institutes of Health in the United States. They all ended up in this place called Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is a center of biological warfare research in the United States. So they started in the 1960s. They really had no idea what this causative agent was doing or what it was. They thought it might be a slow virus. So they started injecting these brain slurries into every animal they could get their hands on. Everything like from chimpanzees. They set up this sort of zoo-like area in Maryland. There was actually a wildlife reserve in Maryland. And they started injecting deer. They started injecting chimpanzees, mice, rats, anything they could lay their hands on to see if these animals would get sick, and a lot of them did. But the problem with that is that the wildlife reserve was so poorly secure that a lot of these animals escaped. And so the origin of this hypothesis is that this prion, which is a very slow way of dying, was moving slowly through the food chain. And there was a major outbreak of this prion disease in northeastern Colorado in the 60s. And so the cattle mutilation phenomenon erupted in northeastern Colorado around the same time, roughly temporally. And so, you've got all these sort of lights in the sky that were causing these animals or associated with these animals dying. And so the hypothesis we put out was that they were actually monitoring the spread of these prions as it spread through the cattle herds in northeastern Colorado. And then they found that they were spreading a lot quicker through the United States.
And it's scary as hell. Cullum's book, Brain Trust, tracks the spread of this. It really is through the food chain. Those animals get out, a deer is infected, it gets hit, and somebody grinds it up and feeds it to other animals. These prions are indestructible, so now those animals have it. So you've had cows eating cows, and they get it, and then they get ground up, and people eat them, and it goes into humans. There's been an explosion. We don't call it mad cow anymore, but other kinds of brain diseases, brain wasting diseases that nobody wants to talk about, that nobody wants to admit might be related to this, because they don't want to alienate the beef industry or the pig industry. They want people to keep on eating this stuff.